It had been a hard week. And after all those days traveling with Jesus throughout his life and his ministry, and then spending that week in Jerusalem, entering with a parade and palms and shouts of joy, and then being served and learning about service by having their feet washed by their teacher, sharing a meal, learning together about God's story of freedom once again, struggling in the garden, praying, wishing, hoping for a different way, seeking the right thing to do, and then finally coming to the point where there's nothing left but sacrifice. The friends of Jesus found themselves at the foot of the cross, taking their friend's body down with no time to prepare for a proper burial. They wrapped him up and he was put into the tomb, and they had to seal it over because it was about to be the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, they couldn't do any work. So even though normally they would have anointed his body, covered it with perfumes and spices and oils, they couldn't do any of that. And so through the whole Saturday, they waited. And on Sunday morning, very early, it was still a little bit dark out, the women whose job it was to take care of their friend at the last decided it was time. They picked up their spices and their oils and their perfumes, and they walked along to the cemetery. They walked along, coming to the graves. They walked along wondering how they would find someone to help them to open it. How could they do their job, their duty as a friend, if they could not open the tomb? But then, as they came closer and closer, they arrived at the tomb and they found that it was already open. Someone had been there before them. Can you imagine what they must have felt like? The fear, wondering who had gotten here first. They had their spices and their perfumes in their hands, and they were not sure what to do. The tomb was open. And they looked inside, and they found not Jesus, but a man in dazzling clothes who said to them, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has been raised, just like he told you. So go and tell the others the amazing news that Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed." Now the women were not really sure what to do, but they definitely heard those words and they understood that they had to go and tell someone right away. So they ran back as fast as they could through the cemetery, past the graves, and finally they came back to the house where they were staying, and they met all of the other disciples there, and they said, "He's not here." And not just he's not here, he's alive. They told them this amazing news. He's alive. You guys, he's alive. Just like he said, he is risen. Now, the disciples did not know what to do with this. They had never heard about anything like this before. Nobody comes back from the dead. But Peter, got up and ran out. And he ran through the town, to the edge of the town, into the cemetery, found the grave, but he didn't go in. He just looked in, and he saw all the cloth they had used to wrap up Jesus' body was just lying there by itself. There was no body, no Jesus. Why was he looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's been raised. He is alive. And Peter went home amazed at what had happened. He didn't know what to say. He had no idea, no words for this, but it happened. Now, later on that afternoon, some more of Jesus' disciples, 2 of them, one was called Cleopas, and the other one, we don't know their name. It could have been his wife. It could have been a friend. It could be you. Cleopas and his friend were walking, going home to Emmaus, which is about 7 miles. They walked, and while they were walking, a person came up and started speaking to them, and he said, "Why are you looking so sad? It's a festival time." Remember, it was still Passover. "Why are you looking so sad?" And they stopped walking, and they looked down, and they said, "Are you the only one who doesn't know?" And he said, "Know what?" And they told him that their friend, Jesus, who they thought was the Messiah, had instead been killed, that he had sacrificed himself, and that they didn't know what to do. This was not how they thought the story was going to go. And he said to them, this stranger on the road said, "Don't you understand anything?" And they were like, "What do you mean? We understand perfectly that we learned about serving, and we learned about sharing, we learned about struggle, we learned how to seek God's way, and we saw the truth of sacrifice, and now we are alone, except something strange happened this morning. The women went to do their job to take care of the body, and they came back and said he isn't there." But we don't know what to think about that. And the stranger walked along with them, and he told them stories from the Bible, from the very beginning of God's creation all the way through, leaving the Red Sea and crossing the wilderness and entering the promised land and building the temple, and stories of kings and prophets, stories about the Messiah. When they reached the end of their journey, they arrived at home at Emmaus, and this stranger acted like he was going to keep walking. He'd already walked 7 miles. Where else could he go? So they insisted that he come in and at least have dinner with them. So they sat down at the table for the evening meal, and the stranger was the one who picked up the bread, and he prayed over it, giving thanks. And he broke the bread in half, and he gave it to them, and suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. They knew it was Jesus. He had been with them all along. Now, at that moment, when they recognized him, he vanished from their sight. They could not see him anymore, but they still felt him. And they said to each other, "Weren't our hearts burning while he was telling us all of these stories while we walked along? Aren't our hearts burning now?" And they got up from the table and they ran 7 miles back to Jerusalem, and they met the disciples there, and they said, "We have seen the Lord. He has been raised. He's alive. He's not here. He's alive. So let's look for the living among the living."